Welcome to the boardroom of the National Transportation Safety Board. I'm Robert Sumwalt, and I'm honored to serve as the chairman of the NTSB. And joining us today are my colleagues on the board, Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg, Member Earl Weiner, Member Jennifer Homendy. Today we meet in open session as required by the government and the Sunshine Act to consider the crash involving a Lear 35A while approaching New Jersey's Teterboro Airport on May the 15th, 2017. Today is the first board meeting that the NTSB has had of this year. Had it not been for the 5-week partial government shutdown, this would have been the fourth board meeting that we have held. And furthermore, this board meeting for this product would have been a month earlier. In the accident that we're deliberating today, the pilots allowed the aircraft to stall, and they subsequently lost control of the aircraft as they were turning onto final on a poorly flown circling approach. The airplane struck a commercial building and parking lot and was destroyed by impact forces in a post-crash fire. And tragically, both pilots lost their lives. On behalf of my colleagues on the board and the entire NTSB, we'd like to offer our sincerest condolences to the families and friends of those pilots. The purpose of our being here is to learn from this so that others don't have to go through what you have gone through. The accident occurred on a positioning flight operated by Trans-Pacific Air Charter, a Part 135 operator. Part 135 of the Federal Aviation Regulations governs on-demand charter operations as well as air medical and commuter flights. The nuance here is because this was a positioning flight, one without revenue passengers or cargo on board, the flight was conducted under Part 91, General Operating Rules of the Federal Aviation Regulations. However, the accident does raise important questions about what can be done to improve the safety of Part 135 operations. Part 121 of the Federal Aviation Regulations governs what most people think of when they hear the term commercial aviation, regularly scheduled air carrier flights. That said, if Part 135 aviation had the same tools as Part 121, we might not be here today. One more time. If Part 135 aviation had the same tools as Part 121, we might not be here today. The accident might not have occurred. Improve the safety of Part 135 aircraft operations is on our most wanted list of transportation safety improvements. And this accident illustrates the potential safety benefits of applying knowledge gained in Part 121 investigations and adopting solutions already introduced in Part 121 flight to Part 135 operations. Now, we realize that Part 121 and 135 can't do everything the same way, but we do believe that there should be an equivalent level of safety between the two. This accident highlights the problem of procedural noncompliance. According to Trans-Pacific Standard Operating Procedures, or SOPs, the second in command, who was the flying pilot, had not yet gained the experience necessary to fly the airplane, yet the captain of the flight disregarded company policy and allowed the second in command to be the flying pilot. Both pilots had broken with procedures in other ways. The pilot in command had not obtained a weather briefing for the accident flight or conducted adequate pre-flight planning, and the pilots did not brief the approach during the flight. Furthermore, performance deficiencies that had been noted during the pilot's initial training were not being monitored by the company for reoccurrence. Safety programs used by Part 121 operators might have detected such deficiencies. More directly, Part 121 air carriers are required to have programs that ensure that performance deficiencies are corrected. To date, such programs are not required for Part 135. In a former life, while serving as an airline pilot, I was also a member of the Flight Operational Quality Assurance Team, or FOQA team. In that role, We looked at minor procedural deviations in non-accident flights. Now, as an NTSB board member, I've seen too many cases where accidents occurred, including today's case at hand, that are due in part to procedural non-compliance and a lack of professionalism. One thing I can tell you is that you might be born with certain aptitudes, but nobody is born a professional. It takes work and constant discipline. Professionalism is a mindset that includes hallmarks such as precise checklist usage, precise call-outs, and precise compliance with SOPs and regulations. Those traits were conspicuously absent on this flight. The pilot and command's use of expletive were one such disconcerting symptom. Now, when transcribing the sounds recorded on a cockpit voice recorder, the NTSB denotes expletives using a hashtag symbol. There were so many hashtags in this transcript, it reads like a social media feed. 131 expletives in a half an hour. That averages to one expletive every 14 seconds. That's just one symptom of a shocking lack of professionalism. Another far more problematic issue was the flight crew's disregard for procedural compliance. Following SOPs puts a pilot in a position to succeed. They also form a strong defense against accidents. Years ago, my colleague Earl Weiner led a study where he and his team analyzed over 100 airline accidents. They found that the highest ranked accident prevention strategy was for pilots to follow standard operating procedures. The highest ranked accident prevention strategy is following procedures. Operators need to detect whether their pilots are complying with SOPs, but Part 135 operators do not have all the tools they need to ensure procedural compliance. And one such tool is Safety Management Systems, or SMS. As the FAA describes it, it's a top-down, organization-wide approach to managing safety risk and ensuring the effectiveness of safety risk controls. It includes systematic procedures, practices, and policies for the management of risk. Another such tool, Flight Data Monitoring, or FDM. FDM programs look at routine, non-accident data for deviations or unsafe practices, like FOQA programs in Part 121. But such programs are not currently required, and some Part 135 operators even lack basic data recording capabilities needed to support FDM. The accident flight was also an example of poor crew resource management. CRM done well results in effective communications and workload management and adherence to SOPs. However, during the accident flight, the captain had to extensively coach the second in command as the flying pilot, while the captain was also having to perform his responsibilities as pilot monitoring. And as you'll hear, he did neither well, and both pilots lacked situational awareness. Here, too, there's a difference between the implementation of CRM in Part 121 versus Part 135. Now, I want to make this point. There are many very good Part 135 operators, but Part 121 operators have tools that many 135 operators don't have. The safety of Part 135 aviation can be improved. In a moment, investigators will provide the details of this accident flight, and as they present their findings, bear in mind how this flight might have been different if lessons from Part 121 accidents had been applied. Staff have pursued all avenues in proposing findings, a probable cause, and recommendations to the board. Now, the order of the meeting will be the staff will make presentations. I think there's 3 presentations. They will make those presentations. And then we on the board will question staff We will also propose and vote on any amendments necessary to ensure that the report, as we adopt it today, truly provides the best opportunity to enhance safety. Our public docket, available at ntsb.gov, contains almost 1,100 pages of additional information, including photos and post-accident interviews. Once finalized, the accident report will be available on the NTSB's website. So, Deputy Managing Director Paul Sledzik, if you would kindly introduce the staff. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few announcements before we begin. I kindly request for those here in the boardroom, if you've not done so already, please silence your mobile phones or other electronic devices. There are 2 exits in front of the auditorium on either side of the dais, one to the left, one to the right. Go down the stairs, out the door, and follow the illuminated exit signs to depart the facility. You may also exit to the rear of the auditorium where you entered. And if you do exit that way, proceed out the glass doors, go up the stairs, and exit straight ahead through the large glass doors, turn to your left, and walk to the end of the street. In the event of an emergency, please walk quickly to the nearest exit and make your way to the outside following the instructions of NTSB staff. Do not return to the boardroom until instructed to do so. If you have any questions or concerns, please see any NTSB staff person. Seated at the panel this morning, unless otherwise noted, are staff members of the Office of Aviation Safety. On the first row, starting to my right, is Dana Schultz, Acting Director of the Office of Aviation Safety. To her right is Jim Silliman, the investigator in charge for this accident. To his right is Captain David Lawrence, Operational Factors. To his right is Dr. Bill Bramble, who will cover human performance. And to his right is Tim Birch, who will cover vehicle performance. Behind Mr. Birch is Jeffrey Marcus, Acting Chief of the Safety Recommendations Division. To his left is Don Ike, who will cover meteorology. To his left is Betty Koschig, who will cover air traffic control issues. To her left is Jim Ritter, Director of the Office of Research and Engineering. To his left is Kathleen Silbaugh, who is our General Counsel. And to her left is Darlene Hatchett, who is the Director of the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. Behind Ms. Hatchett is Lynn Spencer, who will be covering visuals and conducting the timing for the board meeting today. To her right is Adam Gerhardt, who will cover airworthiness issues. To his right is Greg Bossari, who will cover maintenance records. To his right is Sean Payne, who will address any CVR and sound spectrum analyses issues. And to his right is Karen Stein from the Writing and Editing Division in the Office of Aviation Safety. This morning's presentations will begin with opening comments by Dana Schultz.
Good morning, Chairman Sumwalt, Vice Chairman Landsberg, and members of the board. As the chairman indicated, we are once again discussing an accident that highlights why the board has included improving the safety of Part 135 aircraft operations on the NTSB's Most Wanted list for 2019. Notably, staff's report today will highlight findings involving some of the very same safety deficiencies we identified in prior fatal Part 135 accidents. Specifically, widespread noncompliance with company standard operating procedures and oversight deficiencies. The end result of that, from 2000 to 2015, the NTSB investigated 7 major accidents involving Part 135 on-demand operators with findings related to pilot performance. Tragically, those accidents cost the lives of 53 people and seriously injured another 4 people. Part 135 operations often involve carrying passengers for hire, and we believe that more needs to be done to ensure that all Part 135 operators have adequate safety protections in place for the flying public. In a minute, staff from the NTSB's Office of Aviation Safety will discuss the specific findings from our investigation of yet another tragic accident involving a Part 135 operator that took the lives of 2 more people during a positioning flight that resulted in an unstabilized visual approach into Teterboro Airport in Teterboro, New Jersey. As the staff will discuss, flight data monitoring programs, as part of a safety management system, could have played a role in preventing this accident, just as they could have done in preventing the other fatal accidents noted earlier. FDM and SMS complement each other, yielding data that can be used to improve procedural compliance, as well as identify and mitigate operational hazards before they lead to an accident. For those Part 135 operators who have voluntarily implemented SMS and FDM programs, we recognize them for their proactive safety leadership. However, sadly, we continue to see that when operators rely on the minimum FAA requirements, which currently lack SMS and FDM program requirements, safety risk remains unnecessarily high. We're here today to encourage the industry and the FAA to raise the bar on safety for Part 135 operations. Chairman Zumwalt, Mr. Jim Silliman, the investigator in charge, will now present an overview of the accident report under consideration by the board today. Thank you.
Good morning. Today we'll discuss the details of the Learjet 35A that crashed while flying into Teterboro Airport in Teterboro, New Jersey on May 15, 2017. An animation of the accident about 10 minutes in length was created using information from the ground radar, the airplane's enhanced ground proximity warning system, the airplane's cockpit voice recorder, and air traffic control's recordings of conversations between the captain and air traffic controllers. The animation depicts the flight of the airplane from takeoff until the accident occurs. The animation also contains a short video of the accident was captured by a security camera located near the accident site. The security video is shown at the end of the 10-minute animation. For those of you in the boardroom, if you do not wish to listen to the ATC transmissions or view the video, you may exit the boardroom now, and those watching by webcast may wish to turn down the volume and turn away from their display. Please play the animation. On May 15, 2017, about 3:29 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, a Learjet 35A departed control flight while flying the ILS Runway 6 Circle to Land Runway 1 approach at the Teterboro Airport in Teterboro, New Jersey. The captain and the second in command died. No one on the ground was injured. The airplane was destroyed by impact forces and post-crash fire. The Part 91 positioning flight departed the Philadelphia International Airport, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, bound for Teterboro about 3:04 p.m. The straight line distance from Philadelphia to Teterboro was about 80 nautical miles, and the flight lasted about 25 minutes. The flight to Teterboro was the crew's third and last planned trip for the day. The company had designated the second in command as a second in command 0, which meant that he could only perform pilot monitoring duties. Company policy required the captain to always be the pilot flying when flying with the second in command. However, the cockpit voice recording indicated the second in command was the pilot flying for all but the final 15 seconds of the accident flight. For most of the flight, the captain instructed the second in command in flying the airplane, including flight basics such as altitude and airspeed. The cockpit voice recording also indicated that the crew failed to complete any of the required checklists during the flight, contrary to published guidance in company manuals. The captain filed an Instrument Flight Rules flight plan which requested altitude of 27,000 feet for a planned distance of about 120 nautical miles, with an estimated time en route of 28 minutes. The crew's planned route is depicted in white. Air traffic control cleared them to fly at 4,000 feet. They were cleared for a slightly shorter route, shown in blue. The white arrow indicates the airplane's position and heading, and the magenta line shows the airplane's actual ground track. During the climb and level off at 4,000 feet, the captain instructed the second in command to keep the airspeed below the FAA restriction of 250 knots for flight below 10,000 feet. Radar data indicated that the crew exceeded the airspeed restriction multiple times during the 25-minute flight. About 8 minutes into the flight, when the airplane was only about 54 miles from the Teterboro Airport, the captain requested a higher altitude, not realizing how close they were to the airport. The controller denied the request, saying it would require the airplane be turned away from Teterboro to be resequenced.
452 Delta Alpha, any chance it can higher?
452 Delta Alpha, unable higher. I would have to spin you back around and sequence you with the rest of the traffic going into Teterboro.
About 2 minutes later, when the airplane was about 48 nautical miles from the Teterboro Airport, Air traffic control began vectoring the airplane for the ILS runway 6 circle to runway 1 approach to the Teterboro Airport.
Clear 452 Delta Alpha, New York approach, Newark altimeter 2975, flighting 020, vector ILS 6, circle 1.
Okay, we got 299 here, excuse me, what was that again? Say that again for 452 Delta Alpha.
The altimeter is 2975 at Newark. Clear 2 Delta Alpha, flighting 020, vector ILS 6, circle 1.
Okay, 020, 452 Delta Alpha.
The cockpit voice recording indicated that the captain questioned the reason for the vectors and assigned approach, because he told the second command that they were still hundreds of miles away. About 26 seconds later, air traffic control gave a descent clearance.
Clear 2 Delta Alpha, descend and maintain 3000.
3000, 2 Delta Alpha.
After acknowledging that clearance, the captain realized that they were close to Teterboro and stated that they would be at Teterboro in 10 minutes. Air traffic control began providing radar vectors to intercept the localizer inbound course.
Clear 2 Delta Alpha, flighting at 090, intercept the 6 localizer, contact New York approach 127.6.
Okay, 127.6, fly heading 090 to intercept the 6 in the Teterboro, 452 Delta Alpha.
While attempting to join the localizer, the second command mistook the Newark International Airport for Teterboro and told the captain that he had the runway in sight. The airplane flew through the localizer course of 060 degrees, and shortly after, air traffic control stated the following.
Learjet 2 Delta Alpha, make sure you intercept the localizer.
452 Delta Alpha, copy.
Learjet 2 Delta Alpha, left turn 20, heading for New Jersey.
You got it, 452 Delta Alpha.
The airplane turned left and intercepted the localizer inbound. Air traffic control then directed the flight to the waypoint Vings.
Learjet 2 Delta Alpha, can you go to Vings? Can you do that? Vings, intercept localizer 6.
452 Delta Alpha, copy.
While the airplane was inbound to Vings, the second command attempted to transfer the controls to the captain, but the captain did not respond and the second in command continued to fly the approach. Air traffic control cleared the airplane for the approach.
Learjet 452 Delta Alpha, 8 miles from Vings, cross Vings at 2,000 feet, clear ILS runway 6, circle runway 1.
Okay, cleared ILS 6, circle 1, Vings 2000, 452 Delta Alpha.
The pilots did not conduct an approach briefing before beginning the approach, contrary to published guidance in company manuals. The captain stated to the second command that they would be circling to runway 1 and would be descending to the circling minimums of 760 feet. The Teterboro Airport was located in either Newark, John F. Kennedy, and LaGuardia airports. To avoid conflicts with those airports, aircraft landing at Teterboro when the wind is from the north are often vectored to approach from the west, then circle to land to the north on runway 1. The white line shows the ground tracks of previous aircraft flying the same circling approach that was assigned to the accident airplane. On the day of the accident, the wind was from the northwest at 16 to 20 knots, gusting to 32 knots. The initial approach clearance issued to the airplane was to fly the ILS runway 6 circle to runway 1. Airplanes flying this approach were typically told to circle at Torby, which was 3.8 nautical miles from the approach end of runway 6. After Torby, they would turn right and visually fly toward MetLife Stadium, and then turn left to line up with runway 1. About 3 minutes after receiving the approach clearance, air traffic control instructed the flight to do 3 things. 1. Contact Teterboro Tower. 2. Cross Dandy at 1,500 feet. 3. Circle at Torby.
Learjet 2 Delta Alpha, contact Teterboro Tower 190.5. Shoot across Dandy, 1,500 feet, circle at Torby.
All right, Dandy, 200 feet, circle at Torby, 925, 452 Delta Alpha.
Dandy at 1,500 feet, 2 Delta Alpha.
2015, 452 Delta Alpha.
The flight crew acknowledged these instructions, but failed to do all 3. First, they did not contact the tower. Second, the airplane crossed Dandy at 2,000 feet instead of 1,500 feet. Third, they did not turn at Torby. From this point on, the movement of the white airplane symbol and radio communications occur in real time. As the airplane crossed Torby, the captain continued to instruct the second command improperly directing him to descend to the minimum descent altitude of 760 feet, while the airplane continued straight toward runway 6, instead of turning right at Torby and proceeding visually to the runway. 1.5 minutes later, the crew still had not switched to the tower radio frequency until told a second time by air traffic control.
2 Delta Alpha, contact Teterboro Tower 19.5.
19.5, 452 Delta Alpha.
The captain continued to instruct the second in command to descend to 760 feet instead of contacting the tower.
Clear 452 Delta Alpha, Teterboro Tower.
Yeah, we're up for the circling 1, 2 Delta Alpha.
Roger, Lear 452 Delta Alpha, wind 36016, gust 32, runway 1, continue traffic holding in position.
452 Delta Alpha.
The airplane continued toward the airport as the captain instructed the second in command to stop the descent.
Air 2 Delta Alpha, runway 1, clear to land, safe parking.
We're going to be at Jet Aviation, 452 Delta Alpha, clear to land 1.
When the airplane was about 1 nautical miles from the end of runway 6, the tower questioned the crew about the turn.
He's landing 5 Delta Alpha, you can start that turn?
Yes, sir, we're doing it right now, 452 Delta Alpha.
While starting the turn to the right, the second in command told the captain, "Your flight controls," but the captain did not respond. The airplane lost 300 feet in the turn, and the enhanced ground proximity warning system sounded, 500 feet, and sink rate, pull up. The second in command asked the captain to take the flight controls again, and finally the captain took the controls, directed the second in command to watch the airspeed, and began a high bank left turn to runway 1. During the turn, the second in command called airspeed 4 times. The captain called out stall, as the second in command agreed and repeated airspeed twice. The enhanced ground proximity warning system sounded, sink rate, pull up. A security camera captured the airplane as it impacted the ground at a right bank angle of about 125 degrees. The airplane crashed in the parking lot less than 1 mile southeast of the Teterboro Airport about 15 seconds after the captain took the controls. This is an aerial view of the impact point at the wreckage path and the parking lot where the airplane crashed. Runway 1 can be seen in the background. This is an aerial view of the wreckage debris path. Staff found that there were no pre-impact structural, engine, or system failures. Although the accident flight was a Part 91 positioning flight, Trans-Pacific is a Part 135 operator, and staff identified the following issues related to the safety of Part 135 operations, which is currently on our most wanted list of safety improvements. Many Part 135 operators lack flight data monitoring programs and safety management systems. Also, the FAA does not have a system to ensure that operators have programs in place to identify pilot noncompliance with standard operating procedures. We also identified that Trans-Pacific didn't have a program to monitor pilots with demonstrated performance deficiencies, and the FAA lacks specific guidance for Part 135 crew resource management training and leadership training for upgrading captains at Part 121, 135, and 91K operators. The presentation by Captain Lawrence and Dr. Bramble will address these issues. Additionally, we identified that Trans-Pacific had not incorporated the manufacturer recommended approach speed wind additives in their operations manual. Staff has proposed a recommendation to include this wind additive in Learjet 35A operations manuals in order to reduce the risk of a stall in weather conditions conducive to rapid and possibly unexpected wind changes. I would like to acknowledge staff who participated in this investigation. Staff was assisted by party representatives from the FAA, Trans-Pacific Air Charter, Bombardier, Honeywell Aerospace, and the National Air Traffic Controllers Association. Chairman Sumwalt, this concludes my presentation. Captain David Lawrence will discuss operational issues.
Good morning. During the investigation, we determined that the flight crew was properly certificated and there was no indication that the flight crew was impaired by medical conditions, alcohol, or other drugs. However, as Mr. Silliman explained, we found other issues. I will discuss the pilot's background and training, the captain's decision to allow the second in command, or SIC, to fly the airplane, and the pilot's pre-flight planning and in-flight actions, including the pilot's execution of the approach into Teterboro. I will also discuss the methods that Part 135 operators, including Trans-Pacific and the FAA, could identify non-compliance with standard operating procedures or SOPs. According to the training records, both pilots had difficulties during initial company training executing circle-to-land approaches, and the SIC experienced difficulties in basic control of the Learjet. Post-accident interviews with both pilots, simulator instructors, and previous employers confirmed the concerns about the pilot's performance. Trans-Pacific was aware of the pilot's training deficiencies and approved additional training for both pilots, which they subsequently passed. However, despite the company's knowledge of the pilot's training difficulties, they were paired together following their training with no process to monitor their subsequent performance or identify and correct any continued deficiencies. Staff believes that Part 135 operators should establish programs that monitor the performance of pilots who have demonstrated deficiencies during training and has proposed a recommendation in this area. Trans-Pacific had a defined policy to have SICs gain experience in the cockpit before they could manipulate the controls of an airplane as the pilot flying, or PF. New SICs, including the accident SIC, were not permitted to operate as the pilot flying, whether on revenue or positioning flights. However, contrary to company policy, for the accident flight, the captain allowed the SIC to be the pilot flying, and the captain was the pilot monitoring. The captain's decision to have the SIC serve as pilot flying placed both pilots in unfamiliar roles and interfered with the normal division of duties between the pilot flying and pilot monitoring regarding certain tasks, such as making standard callouts and initiating checklists. In addition, the SIC's performance of basic flying tasks was weak, as evidenced by difficulties he experienced with aircraft control throughout the flight, and the captain provided extensive coaching, which distracted him and reduced his capacity for performing the role of pilot monitoring. Thus, the captain's decision to have the SIC serve as pilot flying resulted in degraded crew performance. Other actions on the day of the flight were also contrary to company procedures. The accident occurred on the third and final scheduled flight of the day. Records indicate that the captain checked the weather at Teterboro prior to the first flight of the day, but there was no evidence that he reviewed the weather before departing on the accident flight almost 9 hours later. In addition, the flight plan to Teterboro filed by the captain requested an altitude of 27,000 feet, which was incompatible altitude for the short 28-minute flight from Philadelphia, indicating that the crew devoted little attention to pre-flight planning and that they did not have a clear understanding of the flight route and distance and the time pressure that they would face. When the airplane was 48 miles and 18 minutes from Teterboro, air traffic control told the crew to expect the instrument landing system, or ILS, runway 6 approach to runway 1. The CVR transcript indicated that the captain was uncertain about the approach the controller referenced, but the crew did not seek clarification from ATC. This would have been an opportunity for the crew to brief the approach as required by company procedures, but the approach briefing was not performed. Because the crew failed to conduct an approach briefing, the navigation radios were not properly set for the approach, and the distance measuring equipment was not tuned to identify multiple points on the approach, so the crew had to figure out the approach in real time. The lack of an approach briefing and improperly tuned navigation equipment led to crew confusion about the airplane's position relative to approach waypoints and difficulty complying with the approach vertical profile, which ultimately led to a late initiation of the circle-to-land maneuver. This slide shows airplane tracks based on FAA radar data. Before the accident, 56 airplanes flew the same approach to Teterboro as the accident airplane. Those airplane tracks are shown in green, and the airplane track for the accident flight is shown in magenta. Also shown is the Torby intersection, which is the final approach fix for the approach. Torby was located 3.8 nautical miles from the approach end of runway 6. At that point, flights began maneuvering toward runway 1. As shown by the magenta flight track, the accident airplane flew past Torby and did not start the right circling turn until the aircraft was less than 1 mile from the approach end of runway 6. Besides failing to brief the approach, the pilots did not complete any checklist during the flight. In the final seconds of the approach, the captain took control but failed to execute a go-around when the airplane was no longer in a position to make a stabilized approach to runway 1. All of these errors were contrary to company SOPs. SOPs are widely recognized as a basic element of safe aviation operations and are an effective countermeasure against operational errors. However, because this flight crew failed to adhere to numerous SOPs during this flight, the pilots were ill-prepared to conduct the approach into Teterboro. Trans-Pacific did not have a means to identify this crew's noncompliance with SOPs, and the company had no way to determine whether this or any crew's previous operations were conducted in accordance with SOPs. Pilot noncompliance with SOPs has been a recurring issue in accident investigations involving Part 135 operators, and improving the safety of Part 135 aircraft flight operations is now part of the NTSB's most wanted list of transportation safety improvements. The NTSB has been advocating for programs to address pilot noncompliance with SOPs. Flight data monitoring, or FDM systems installed on aircraft, and FDM programs designed to evaluate operational data can provide valuable information to allow an operator to detect trends of noncompliance with procedures and correct deviations from company SOPs. In addition, increased FAA oversight through its Safety Assurance System, or SAS, could help identify those Part 135 operators, such as Trans-Pacific, that did not monitor their pilots' compliance with SOPs. Because staff's investigation determined that the accident operator would have benefited from flight data monitoring and increased FAA oversight through its SAS program, staff proposes reiterating 3 recommendations in this area. These recommendations were initially issued in 2016 as a result of our investigation into an accident in Akron, Ohio involving a Part 135 operator. In summary, safety could be improved if Part 135 operators provided additional oversight and training for pilots with known performance and training deficiencies to ensure that such deficiencies are appropriately addressed and corrected. In addition, as this and other accidents have shown, Part 135 operators could benefit from flight data monitoring programs and increased FAA oversight through its SAS program to ensure pilot compliance with SOPs. This concludes my presentation. Dr. Bramble will now discuss the human performance issues associated with this accident.
Good morning. I will be discussing the adequacy of existing FAA guidance for Part 135 crew resource management training, lack of leadership training for upgrading captains, and a lack of a safety management system requirement for Part 135 operators. According to the FAA's Risk Management Handbook, CRM training emphasizes situation awareness, communication skills, teamwork, task allocation, and decision-making within a comprehensive framework of standard operating procedures. CRM training has been required for all Part 135 pilots since March 2013, and Part 135 pilots' CRM skills are developed through mandatory initial and recurrent training. During the accident flight, the crew disregarded numerous SOPs and exhibited poor planning and communication, which led to high workload and degraded situation awareness. Thus, the flight crew's teamwork was less than optimal and did not represent effective CRM. The FAA requires Part 135 operators to provide CRM training on 8 specific CRM topics. Trans-Pacific CRM training, which consisted of a 27-slide presentation, referenced all required topics. However, the training did not explicitly state the importance of adhering to SOPs for effective teamwork, a major deficiency observed in this crew. Trans-Pacific training materials highlighted the negative effects of excessive workload, but the training did not discuss the impact of planning, briefing, and decision-making on workload and time management, another deficiency observed in this crew. The materials did emphasize crew briefings, but standard crew briefings were omitted during the accident flight. In short, Trans-Pacific CRM training did not adequately address some important aspects of CRM, and it was ineffective at producing desired behaviors in some areas that the training did address. Although the FAA requires Part 135 CRM training programs, the FAA does not provide adequate guidance indicating how Part 135 operators should train the 8 required CRM topics. The guidance that the FAA provides is geared towards Part 121 CRM training programs and Part 135 operators who train in accordance with Part 121 requirements. For example, Part 121 CRM guidance makes extensive reference to line-oriented flight training, which is not common in Part 135 training programs. FAA research has identified factors that influence CRM training effectiveness, and this research could be used to develop guidance to help Part 135 operators implement effective CRM training programs. Such guidance is needed, and staff has proposed a recommendation in this area. The next issue that my presentation covers involves the ineffective leadership shown by the captain during the accident flight. Compliance with company SOPs pertaining to pre-flight planning and approach briefing would have improved this crew's performance. As crew leader, the captain was responsible for reinforcing compliance with SOPs as a means of managing crew workload and avoiding errors. By not doing so, he demonstrated poor leadership. A review of Trans-Pacific's CRM training program revealed that it did not adequately address a captain's role as crew leader, especially as that pertained to reinforcing SOP compliance. A review of the captain's employment history indicated that before he was hired by Trans-Pacific, he had not served as a Part 135 captain, and no evidence indicated that he had received formal leadership training to prepare him for the leadership responsibilities associated with an upgrade to captain. We have noted deficiencies in captain's leadership in previous accident investigations, including the 2009 accident involving Colgan Air Flight 3407 in Clarence Center, New York. And we have open recommendations in this area that staff propose for reiteration. The final subject of my presentation involves safety management. Trans-Pacific had a safety officer but no SMS or other formal safety program to address safety risks. An SMS requires operators to incorporate formal system safety methods into their internal oversight programs. Such a program could have identified and mitigated the hazards found during this accident investigation, including those associated with an unauthorized SIC acting as pilot flying, the pairing of pilots with a history of training difficulties, and inadequate staffing for the company's progressive SIC qualification program. Our agency has recognized the value of SMS, and we have previously recommended that the FAA broaden SMS requirements to include Part 135 operators. Staff proposes that recommendation for reiteration as well. In summary, safety could be improved by requiring CRM training guidance that appropriately addresses the needs of Part 135 operators. Also, the safety of operations conducted under Part 121, 135, and 91K could be improved by requiring leadership training for upgrading captains. In addition, requiring safety management systems for Part 135 operators would provide a means for incorporating formal system safety methods into company internal oversight programs. This concludes staff presentations.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you for those informative and concise presentations. Also, I thought the animation was superb, so thanks to all who have been involved in that. We'll now begin with the board member questions, beginning with Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not quite sure who to direct this question to, but it was very illustrative that out of 56 approaches that were done prior to the accident, we determined that at least 8 were not aligned with the runway by 500 feet above ground level, which is what we normally define as a stabilized approach in visual conditions. It's early in the morning for math, but that works out to about 14%. And maybe there were more. So it seems like this might be a moderately complicated kind of an approach. Just curious, would there be any opportunity for maybe a little more guidance from ATC to reinforce the fact that people should be starting the approach a little bit sooner? It went really quickly at least on the initial clearance, about the circle, runway 6, circle to 1. And there was no guidance that that was done at Torby. That came later. I don't know if this makes any sense or not, but any comments on that?
Well, Vice Chairman, I'll defer the air traffic control portion of that question to Ms. Koshik, but as far as from a pilot standpoint, this particular approach, we did take a look at the certification standards and the flight testing for the circle approach, and it met all criteria and all TERPS criteria, so it wasn't any different than any other circling approach.
Understand.
But one thing to bear in mind that the approach in this case was essentially the ILS. They were shooting the ILS to get to the Torby intersection. Based on the air traffic control clearance, at that point it becomes a visual approach.
Understand.
Not a circle approach. And I defer the air traffic control and their assistance to Ms. Koshik.
Well, I think the captain was fixated on the fact that he was asking the second in command to descend to the IFR circling minimums, which just goes along with the fact that he really wasn't I don't think we need to pursue this any farther, Ms. Koshik. Again, a little early for math, but looking at the Lear 35 flight manual, the ref speed was 119 knots, and also the guidance is that one is to maintain about 20 knots above that while they are getting the aircraft established prior to, let's say, 500 feet. So that comes out to roughly about 140 knots. The wind factors were 15 gusting to 30 roughly, which would be an 8-knot additive gust factor, which gets us close to about 148 knots or 150 knots before getting aligned with the runway. Does that sound about right to you?
That's correct if those calculations were to assume using the Learjet Bombardier guidance for wind additives. What we found in the investigation is that you're correct, they were supposed to fly VREF plus 20, which would have been 139 for their flight all the way around the pattern until they were aligned with the runway. But Trans-Pacific did not incorporate any of the wind additive guidance that was in the AFM.
Does the company SOPs take precedence over the airplane flight manual?
Well, operators, when they develop an airplane or produce an airplane, they're required to have an airplane flight manual. And operators, when they take delivery of that aircraft, they're encouraged to develop their own general operating or pilot handbook, incorporating a lot of the material that's in that AFM. Some of the AFM material must be in the company operating manuals, like certain limitations, certain required procedures, but guidance material similar to the wind additive, that was just suggested. They suggested adding half the gust factor into it, and it wasn't required to be in their operating manual.
Yeah, that additive is pretty standard across the industry, and it would seem like it would be worth some discussion to figure out if that should be something that should be required. I'll defer the rest of my questions till later. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Member Weiner.
I'd like to follow on for a moment the circling approach discussion. Do some of the Part 121 carriers avoid circle to land approaches?
We didn't poll all the 121s as far as that, but I can tell you that many Part 121 operators have multiple limitations on circle approaches. They may not necessarily ban the circle approaches, but they may require circling approaches be conducted in VFR conditions, 1,000-foot ceiling and 3 miles visibility.
So what are some of the inherent problems with circling approaches?
From an operator standpoint, you just don't do them that often. That's one of the limitations. You see them in training, but you don't see them that often. There's also limited guidance as far as navigation. It becomes a visual approach at that point, and since it's not trained as often, they only see it in training. That's one reason some operators decide not to, or at least put additional limitations on circle to land.
Thank you. Dr. Bramble, the carrier here, Trans-Pacific, had no SMS in place. What would an SMS have done for them had they had a complete SMS in place?
Well, as I mentioned during my statements, it might have detected some of the risk factors that we identified, like the fact that their progressive qualification program for their SICs really wasn't working as intended, which set up an incentive for the PICs to basically make the decision as to when the SICs should fly, as opposed to the company check pilots and standards folks. Another important aspect of SMS is if you have a flight data monitoring program in place, as we also recommended, it would provide a mechanism for developing mitigation strategies and following up on whether those are effective.
So the flight data monitoring is part of an SMS, is that correct?
Correct, yes. It would be part of the safety assurance component.
And that consists of not only just the device on board the airplane to gather in-flight data, but also all of the processes related to what you do with that data afterwards?
Exactly.
Now, we focused on flight data monitoring. In the 121 world, we also add to that ASAP. What would ASAP have done for them?
ASAP's another safety assurance mechanism that allows organizations to detect risks in their operation. It's information that's volunteered by flight crews that might not otherwise be extracted by quantitative flight data monitoring technologies.
So there's a maturity model for SMS, all the way from just at the lower stage introduction all the way to continuous improvement. Is that something that can be put in place rapidly, or is that something that takes a long time to put in place?
It does take time to evolve a fully functioning SMS, and that's why the FAA has classified SMSs in terms of stages of maturity.
So this is something that really reflects the culture of the organization, because the culture needs to be developed as you develop the processes and implement the processes. Is that
Exactly.
a good summary?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Member Weiner and Member Hamady.
Sorry, there's a problem with my mic. First of all, thank you very much. I thought this report was fantastic. You all did a great job, and thank you for taking the time to brief me and a number of times and answering my questions on the report. So I appreciate the time you provided. Captain Lawrence, can you talk a little bit more in detail about the pilot and pilots and the second in command's training and the difficulties they had in training?
Yes, their training was down at CAE Semi-Flight. It was a training center. Both pilots were scheduled about a year, close to once they were first hired, for recurrent training. The captain's difficulties were primarily he had to be trained to proficiency on certain items like VOR approaches, CRM, steep turns, basic maneuvering. He also had defined deficiencies in circle to land maneuvers, which required him to get it. He was scheduled for 2 sim sessions, 1 warm-up sim and then a check ride, and he required 3 additional sims to get through the training. The second in command had multiple basic aircraft control deficiencies that were noted by the instructors. He couldn't even start the engines when he first got in, and he had already been rated on the aircraft and had experience on it. He had basic aircraft control, altitude, heading, airspeed controls issues, and he also had circle to land proficiency issues. He was scheduled for a 5-day footprint with 3 sim sessions and needed an additional 4 sims to get proficient and pass the training.
Was Trans-Pacific made aware of the training difficulties?
Yes, we looked at correspondence between CAE and the company, and they were made aware of both pilots' performance deficiencies, and in both cases, they approved the additional training, so they were aware.
Did they know about concerns from previous employers?
They did do a PREA, which is the Pilot Records Information Act, a background check on the co-pilot or the second in command, and they received the material from him. However, that material met the requirements of PREA, but they didn't go beyond that to find out and ask questions like we did during the investigation. We found out that that company was actually about to perform a performance review and evaluation on the second in command based on his weak performance as a pilot. It wasn't transmitted through the PREA, so they weren't aware of that because they hadn't documented, that previous operator hadn't documented that material. The captain's material, his PREA background check, they requested it of his previous employer, but they never received it. And thus they never had an opportunity to evaluate that documentation that was required before they put him into service. We did an evaluation ourselves of if they had received that PREA, and it would have been benign, the information. There wasn't any performance issues with his previous employer, but that PREA information never got to the Trans-Pacific.
And well, first, should these two have been paired together?
From a FAA standpoint, the FARs, or the Code of Federal Regulations, there wasn't anything that prevented them from being paired together. There are pairing limitations in Part 135 and 135.4. Pilots are not allowed to be paired if they have less than 75 hours each. There's also limitations for the co-pilot if he has less than 100 hours in the type. The captain needs to make all the takeoffs and landings under certain conditions like contaminated runway, wind shear, things like that. But both these pilots had far in excess of the flight time for any of those limitations. So there was absolutely no limitations from a regulatory standpoint. What we do in the report is say, based on their deficiencies, they probably should have been reviewed and those deficiencies considered before pairing them together.
And really quickly, did Trans-Pacific ever audit or observe in-flight operations of the crew?
No, they did not.
Thank you.
Member Hamady, thank you very much. Captain Lawrence, as you pointed out, the second command on this flight had a training record of poor performance. In listening to the cockpit voice recorder, as you and I did last week, I noticed that he was having trouble controlling speed. Do you recall, and I counted it, do you recall how many times the captain reminded him to keep his speed under control?
I don't have the exact count, but it was numerous times.
Yeah, it was 12, according to my count, and I think I read that in the report as well. 12 times in a 25-minute flight. Now, in your experience as an airline captain, how often did you find that someone had to be reminded of their speed?
Well, basic altitude control, airspeed, heading control, those are basic maneuvers in flying an aircraft. And one thing that's a challenge for this co-pilot was that this airplane didn't have auto thrust, so he wasn't relying on autopilot or the auto thrust.
Exactly. I think that just he had he had problems with basic airmanship, speed and altitude control. He had the autopilot engaged, and yet, so really all he had to watch was the speed. And yet 12 times in a 25-minute flight, he had to be reminded to keep the speed under 250 knots or bump it up to 250 knots. The flying distance, and I went in and filed a flight plan, a mock flight plan with flightplan.com yesterday, and the flying distance was 86 miles, direct line distance, 80 miles, but via their route of flight, Medina, Victor 3, Solberg, Teterboro, 86 miles. Now, just doing the simple math, and by the way, that is, there's no such thing as simple math, but as a rule of thumb, we would calculate a descent saying 3 times the altitude. So if he was planning a flight at 27,000 feet, that would mean that he'd have to begin his descent 81 miles out. But yet the flying distance was only 86 miles. What does that tell you right there? A lack of pre-flight planning, lack of situational awareness. Anything else?
Yeah, as we allude to it in the report, it was an incompatible altitude, obviously. And when he filed the flight plan through this program that he did, like you said, it would have given him 4,000 feet as a cruise altitude. So he manually entered that in. Why he did that, we really can't get into his head and understand why. But it does show that he didn't really think about the route before he filed it.
You yourself have a great deal of experience operating in and out of the Northeast. Very busy airspace, and it's a short flight, 25-minute flight. Are there things that they could have done ahead of time to help them get ahead of the game? Like loading the approach, things like that?
Oh, absolutely. They could have actually briefed what they anticipated what the approach is before they even left Philadelphia. There wasn't nothing restricting that. The workload that this flight had dictated that the crew needed to get together before they even started the engines on this and talked about this.
So you can call the ATIS, and there it is right there.
5, just 2, visibility 10, ceiling 4,100 over.
You get on your cell phone and call the Teterboro ATIS and find out before you even leave what they're doing. Program the FMS, pre-brief the approach. If I had a short flight, like from Greensboro to Charlotte, I'd do all that on the ground. And they could have done that. But they were behind before they even started the engines. I talked about procedural compliance, and we certainly did see widespread procedural non-compliance. I cited the study that Member Weiner did years ago. You didn't think I was paying attention in Kuala Lumpur in 1993 when you gave that paper, but I've referred to it many times. Following procedures is a great accident prevention strategy, but data from LOSA data, and we've quoted this in our accident reports before, the crew members who intentionally deviated from standard operating procedures were 3 times more likely to commit other types of errors, mismanage more errors, and find themselves in more undesired aircraft situations compared to those flight crew members who did not intentionally deviate from procedures. And I think that says a lot right there about the importance of following SOPs. Vice Chairman, she's all yours.
For our air traffic specialist, Ms. Koshik, as the chairman has properly pointed out, this crew started in a hole before they ever got going in terms of being behind the aircraft. If once they got airborne, they recognized that things weren't going as well as they should have, and speed limit below 10 is 250, could they have just said to ATC, hey, can we slow down to 200 knots, and can you sequence us that way so we can get a little more time to get caught up to things? Would that cause a major problem?
If they'd have made the request, they more than likely would have gotten it.
Okay, so just because it'll go that fast doesn't mean you have to fly it that fast.
Right.
Okay. reading the party submission by Trans-Pacific, they claim not to know what the pilots were doing. I think we've had some discussion there. And we have a recommendation for monitoring crew behavior. How difficult is that to do? And also, even for 121, I don't know that many companies are monitoring their cockpit voice recorders. We see sterile cockpit violated after the fact all the time. So I'm just curious as to, how we might approach that.
We do have one past recommendation involving the monitoring of audio recordings in the cockpit. I think Mr. Marcus could best address that, but in terms of other avenues, crew behavior and interaction is monitored in a variety of ways. As Member Wayner mentioned earlier, there's the ASAP process where crews can self-report risks and hazards. There's also at big airlines, there are standards committees and professional committees that are run by the airline and the unions where if there are problematic individuals, they can be referred to that committee for exploration. But I refer to Mr. Marcus on the audio recording monitoring rec from the past investigation.
As a result of the Colgan accident, after that occurred, Colgan Airlines wanted to start monitoring the cockpit voice recorders to look for instances of sterile cockpit. Is not the only thing that we were looking for, but a good example of the type of information that we get. There was a great deal of resistance. We issued a recommendation to the FAA to enable the collection of all data sources that would be part of some sort of a flight operations quality assurance. The FAA had problems that if they required the collection of data, they cannot allow the non-punitive. In other words, if they require the collection of data and there is information on there that reveals a violation of FAA rules, the FAA is obligated to then issue a violation to that pilot or carrier. That goes at odds with the principles of flight operations quality assurance that there should be no punishment for revealing a safety problem. We still believe that the FAA should have gone to Congress and sought the authority that would have allowed the non-punitive reporting of required data. Our representatives on Capitol Hill decided that the FAA would not do that, and in the FAA reauthorization of, I believe, 2012, they told the FAA they could not do that. Those recommendations, as a result, were classified closed, reconsidered.
That's unfortunate because I think in this environment of compliance versus enforcement, we'd probably get a lot farther. Now, one last question. On page 36, it says the POI said he'd never done an en route inspection on Trans-Pacific or any 135 operator. He stated it would be difficult to schedule, that he'd have to pay for a return flight. And he stated that you never really know if pilots were complying with SOPs for every flight. So I pose, I guess, a general question here. How can the FAA effectively monitor what's going on with 135s? A lot of these airplanes don't have jump seats, particularly the smaller ones, and so forth. Any thoughts on that?
Well, your question actually alludes to the problem in 135. Many of these smaller operators are operating aircraft that, like this one, doesn't even have a jump seat, so you can't get anybody up there to really monitor on a regular basis. And that's really the basis for us reiterating the recommendations out of Akron to take a more data-driven approach rather than just an en route jump seat, because that's just a snapshot of what the operation. A data-driven approach like an FDM program is a more comprehensive approach to learning about what's going on the operation, and that's what we believe would benefit 135 operators like this one.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Member Wayner.
Do Part 135 operators exercise the loft process at all?
No, there's no requirement under 135 for loft.
Do they voluntarily, are there any carriers or operators who voluntarily incorporate loft?
I don't know the answer to that. There may be some that do incorporate segments of loft in their training, but under 135 for 135, 293, 297, and 299 checks, it's not required.
Okay, by the way, loft is line-oriented flight training, for those who don't recognize it. We've talked about the flight crew's operation of the airplane. We've talked a bit about the status of safety at the operator. What kind of role did the FAA play or could have played in terms of mitigating this situation, avoiding the accident, or et cetera?
Well, from the investigation, we found that the operator, similar to what we found in Akron, doesn't do any en route inspections. They primarily rely on manual reviews and things like that, and they don't get out because of the logistical challenges that have been alluded to earlier of getting into the airplane and doing the en route inspections. And again, that's why we're going down the FDM route, so it's a much more comprehensive. You don't have to rely on the FAA to be in the cockpit doing observation. You can have the operator learn about their operation and develop an SMS program that's comprehensive to incorporate some of the issues that they see in the operation and mitigate those at the operator level.
Now, for several years, the most wanted list has included loss of control as one of the 10 items. This past year, that's been changed to include Part 135. Can you just comment on what the most wanted list says in relation to Part 135 operations?
I think as we've been talking this morning, we see a lot of instances of 135 flights where there are issues with noncompliance with standard operating procedures. The focus of the most wanted list item is on several things. One is that SMS programs be established at all the carriers. A big part of SMS, but something that can be done, is flight data monitoring. That's another one of the issues on the most wanted list. Those two combined will address many of the issues that seem to be a common thread to all of these recommendations with 135 that we've been investigating over and over and over.
Thank you, Mr. Marcus. I'll yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Member Weiner. Member Hamady.
So I think there were a lot of failures at all levels in this accident. I think the crew clearly had significant issues. I think Trans-Pacific could have identified problems and they didn't. In fact, I will note that in Appendix B, Trans-Pacific, in a submission to NTSB dated March 1st, 2018, they submitted a number of actions that they plan to implement in response to the accident, which includes expediting full implementation of a safety management system, which is something that we've encouraged in a number of accidents, and that's a good thing, except on the same date, they filed comments in the public docket which points solely at problems with the crew and fails to recognize that they could have identified unsafe operations among their crew, and that's a concern. I think safety management starts from the top, and if you can't recognize your failings, that's a significant issue. But there were also some problems with FAA too, which have been noted. Do most Part 121 operations have flight data monitoring programs?
Most 121s do have a form. It's called FOQA, Flight Operations Quality Assurance, and those are data-driven approaches that are on the 121 level. Those are pretty much formal. They're voluntary, and ICAO Annex 6 for international operations actually requires 121 operators to have a FOQA program or flight data monitoring program to land in certain countries, but it's not required in the United States.
I was going to ask if they were voluntary. And have we recommended that We've recommended before in past accidents that Part 135 have flight data monitoring, right? Can you talk about some of those accidents? You have briefly mentioned a couple of times Akron, and there are a lot of similarities between Akron and what happened here. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Are you asking what happened in Akron that's similar, or are you asking for other 135?
Either one.
Well, we had a list of 15 accidents, I'm sorry, 7 accidents involving 135 on demand. That's not all 135, it's just 135 similar to this operator of where somebody would charter an airplane to carry people. Those 7 accidents occurred over a 15-year period of time, and we were able to devote the resources to go in and do the in-depth investigation necessary to uncover all of the problems with pilot performance. So those are not all 135 accidents during that 15-year period of time. Those are just the ones that we chose for special processing to get into it to fully understand what was happening. Among those accidents, there was Akron, there was an accident in Owatonna, Minnesota, where a charter jet was landing on a runway, and after they touched down during a raging thunderstorm, while they were midway down the runway, the pilot decided to try and abort the landing and take off at the middle of the runway and overran the runway and killed everybody. There was a very prominent accident in 2002 in Eveleth, Minnesota, involving a Beech King Air. There was a prominent citizen on that airplane, but the pilots were not well trained. They showed very poor crew resource management. They had a whole variety of problems, and they botched the landing and killed everybody on that airplane. There was an accident also at Teterboro in 2005, where an airplane was going down the runway because the pilots had not checked to make sure that it was properly loaded. The center of gravity was too far forward, and the airplane was unable to rotate, take off. It went over the end of the runway and ran into a warehouse that was just beyond the runway at Teterboro Airport. That killed, it was more than a year after the accident, but ultimately one of the passengers in the car that the airplane hit as it was crossing the runway to run into the warehouse died. The pilots, the second in command of that airplane, was not even qualified to be on a 135 flight. Those are just a few examples.
Okay, thanks. And one last question, because I only have a few seconds. Why is it important, Captain Lawrence, to adhere to standard operating procedures?
Talking about standard operating procedures, like in this case, the use of checklists, the use of flying profiles, the CRM, the communication, all these things in a professional cockpit. A professional cockpit is like a choreographed song. It's choreographed and it should sound the same. The tune is the same. Every flight is the same. It's just the performers who are different. So adhering to SOPs is not just it's not just a catchphrase. It's something that is critical to the safety. We've cited it in multiple, like what Mr. Marcus just said, cited in multiple accidents. That failure led to either a fatal event or some type of accident. It's also important to note that strict adherence to SOPs can save lives. This board just adopted a report that went published on the Ypsilanti accident where the overrun on a rejected takeoff that occurred because the airplane was not flyable. It was broken, and there was a check airman in the right seat. And had he tried to take over, which would have been against his SOPs, and tried to attempt to take the airplane off, would have led to a greater loss of life. But he strictly adhered to the SOPs by maintaining his pilot monitoring duties and likely saved lives there. So it's not a catchphrase, doing the SOPs and adhering to them every time. It's safety critical for pilots to adhere to them.
Thank you very much. So Captain Lawrence, let's talk about prior failures, check ride failures. Do you remember how many prior check ride failures? And we're talking about FAA check ride failures the captain had on this flight?
The captain, I believe, had 2 or 3 certification ride failures, one of which was notably as a flight instructor certificate.
Yeah, you had 3, and how about the second officer had 2?
He had 2 for private pilots.
That's right. So I spent a good bit of yesterday going through previous accident reports. Now, bear in mind that the NTSB does not do a board meeting for every accident that we investigate, so we call the ones that we do investigate and publish a report, a thick report on, olden days term, but we call them blue cover reports. At least that's what I still call them. So I went through a number of blue cover reports yesterday involving Part 135 operators where there had been previous failures. Air Sunshine in 2004 scheduled Part 135 passenger commuter. The pilot in command had 9 prior check ride failures. Marlin Air Cessna Citation crashed into Lake Michigan in 2007, Part 135. The captain had a poor training record, previous failures. Global Exec Aviation, a Lear 60 in Columbia, South Carolina, Part 135. The captain had 4 prior failures. ExecuFlight, Part 135 flight, poor performance, poor prior performance, and now this one. So, Mr. Marcus, you and I spoke about this yesterday. In 2005, the NTSB came out with a recommendation, A0527. Can you describe what that recommendation is and what it means?
I think there were actually 3 recommendations issued in 2005. There were 2 issued as a result of the Air Sunshine accident that you were talking about. One of them asked that the FAA obtain notices of disapproval and that airlines, when they hire a pilot, would obtain records of flight check failures of the people they were considering. The FAA said that they will be including that in their pilot records database when that rule is issued. We also asked them to do a study to see if the number of flight check failures in a pilot's record was indicative of the future risk of an accident. We believed, based on what I'll be talking about in a second with A0527, there were indications that it would. The FAA did a study. They concluded from their study that there was no predictive value from that. A0527 was issued as a result of a study that we did of general aviation accidents that were caused by weather issues. As part of the analysis for that study, we found that there seemed to be a fairly predictive value of a pilot being involved in a weather-related accident based on the number of check ride failures in the past. We thought that there was pretty clear statistical evidence from our analysis. We asked the FAA to evaluate that and act on that. The FAA in 2014 told us that they had done a study. They did not look at flight check failures. They looked at where the pilot received their training, and they found that there was no correlation with where the pilot received their training and future risk. But they also identified limitations in the data, and they said that they would be improving the data to do a better analysis. As a result of that, as a result of their indications they would be improving their data resources, we classified that recommendation open acceptable pending the results of that. They have just recently sent us a letter which is currently being evaluated by the board, in which the FAA said that they decided to not do the analysis, not do the improvements in data collection that their study had said were needed, but they believe that their voluntary actions with the General Aviation Joint Safety Committee would take care of it. At this point, we will probably be closing the recommendation, but we have not yet, the board has not yet made a determination.
Thank you. And Captain Lawrence, or maybe Mr. Marcus, clarify this for me. Mr. Marcus mentioned that, so PREA does not currently address prior certificate rides. Is that correct? It doesn't look at something. I can't remember what.
It does look at FAA certification background. It's part of the PREA.
Okay, thank you. Member Weiner, further questions? None?
I have one.
Thank you.
It would seem like the training organizations play a fairly important part in all of this. And I just wonder, this captain, this was his first PIC job, is that correct? And we've noted that he lacked leadership skills in this area. I wonder if it makes sense to make a recommendation to the training organizations to include a leadership module for new captains. Thoughts?
We have a recommendation out of the Colgan accident that the FAA require leadership training for people who are being made captain. The FAA and that recommendation was included in a congressional mandate to the FAA to adopt that rule. That is currently pending a notice of proposed rulemaking from the FAA, which I believe they have recently put on their website of significant rulemakings they plan to issue sometime in 2019. But that rulemaking would include an advisory circular with guidance on training for leadership for upgrading captains.
Okay, well, doesn't sound like they've adopted it yet. Thank you. No further questions, sir.
Member Hamady.
What was the company's stabilized approach criteria in its standard operating procedures?
Their defined basic stable approach criteria said that the aircraft had to be stable by 1,000 feet, aligned with the landing runway by 500 feet. There were also multiple other elements of that. They had to be within 10 knots of airspeed, target airspeed, configured for the approach, fully configured, gear down, flaps full. And one of the other elements of this particular operator, because stable approach criteria are developed at the operator level. So one of the things they said was that all checklists and briefings needed to be completed to be considered stable.
And what should have occurred once the crew realized the approach wasn't stabilized?
The same thing as we've seen in many other 135s like Akron and the others. They should have gone around.
I know staff are proposing a safety alert on this issue. Can you share why it's important for the aviation community?
Well, the stabilized approach is not just for 135s or 121. Every pilot that's flying an airplane should be landing via a stable approach. And so the safety alert is identifying not just this accident, but multiple other accidents to convey that this is not just an operator level or 121, 135, that all pilots need to be stable.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Birch, you've been sitting there very quietly. So as I recall, you computed the stall speed of this aircraft in that configuration to be around where 102 knots, 101, somewhere in there.
Yes, sir.
And but the slowest speed derived from radar was 111 degrees. I'm sorry, 111 knots. But they were in a 35-degree bank angle according to your study. So. Oh, and the 101 or 102 that we just mentioned about, that was compensated for the bank angle, the load factor associated with the bank angle.
Correct.
So what's the difference between the 111 and the 102? What did you account for that difference?
About 9 knots.
Yeah, okay, very good. Like I said, there is no such thing as simple math. But can you elaborate on, so we believe the aircraft stalled, aerodynamically stalled.
We do, Chairman. Things that 102 doesn't account for, and goes back to that gust factor, half the gust factor. If you have a sudden gust and it changes the velocity of the air around the wing, you can quickly find yourself below stall speed. So that was probably part of it. And then the other part is they were making a fairly steep turn to final. Base to final turn. So those control inputs would also change the camber of the wing and the stall speed of each wing. So I think that's the other half of the pie.
Amazing. So you were able to get compute the speeds using radar data.
Yes, sir.
And I think maybe perhaps even the EGPWS.
Yes, we used both and, correlated those. And then Don provided some weather information that, took the radar to airspeeds.
Well, thanks. Thank you very much. Really good work. And Mr. Ike, you've been sitting there quietly as well. And so the winds were very gusty, as we heard. And 16 minutes before the crash, there was a pilot report of an aircraft on approach to LaGuardia, which is fairly close, of wind shear. I think it was a 20 knot loss at 700 feet. So any weather factors here, any possibility of wind shear for this particular crash?
Yes, there was, numerous reports of wind shear across the area, and that's where, again, the whole premise of standard operating procedures, getting a weather briefing, being aware of wind shear when they turned to ATIS. The ATIS frequency would have told them low-level wind shear advisories are in effect. If they had added the additional speed as recommended, they would have been able to at least had a margin over the low-level wind shear that was being reported across the area.
Thank you very much. Finally, regarding SMS, Captain Lawrence, SMS, is it just best for large operators or can it be scalable?
The FAA has actually indicated and provided guidance in presentations that SMS is scalable at any level. Any operator, single airplane, single pilot, all the way up to the major airlines can incorporate SMS.
Do we have any idea at all, probably not because we're primarily an accident investigation agency, do we have any idea at all what percentage of Part 135 operators actually are incorporating SMS?
I have that information, sir.
Great, thank you. Are there any further questions from my colleagues? Great, then let's take a break. Let's come back at 11:15. We are in recess. We'll begin in about 1 minute. We are back in session. Are there any further questions or comments from my colleagues? Two things I'd like to say before we get into reading the findings. And I did make this point in my opening statement. Fact of the matter is, there are a lot of 135 operators out there that do a really fine job. But we at the NTSB, by design, we look at those that don't turn out very well. And that's our universe, and our entire purpose for doing these investigations is frankly so that we can make recommendations to further improve the safety of operations. There's another thing I wanted to read that I meant to read when I was talking about a record of previous failures. In our recommendation letter that we issued in 2005, we talk about check rod, flight check failures. And it says the safety board recognizes that one notice of disapproval for a flight check, along with an otherwise successful record of performance, should not adversely affect the hiring decision. However, the board also recognizes that multiple notices of disapproval for a flight check might be significant, depending on the reason for the disapproval notices. So I did want to make that point. I think that anyone can fail a check ride at any point. I hate to say this publicly, but when I was 18 years old, I failed my instrument check ride on the first try. But guess what? I had 50 check rides, literally 50 check rides after that, and managed to slip through them. So one check ride failure is probably not indicative of a major problem. When you have 9 or 4 or whatever, that might be an issue there. Okay, well, if there are no further comments, Mr. Sledzik, if you'll kindly read the proposed findings.
Thank you, sir. As a result of this investigation, staff proposes 17 findings. Number 1, the flight crew was properly certificated. There was no indication that the flight crew was impaired by medical conditions, alcohol, or other drugs, and there were no pre-impact airplane anomalies that would have precluded normal operation. Number 2, the pilot in command's pre-flight planning was inadequate and incomplete. Number 3, the flight crew members' failure to verify the approach and conduct an approach briefing resulted in confusion and errors that led them to mismanage the vertical profile for the approach and not initiate the circle to land maneuver according to air traffic control instructions. Number 4, the pilot in command's inadequate and incomplete pre-flight planning and the flight crew's lack of an approach briefing contributed to the crew's confusion and lack of situational awareness during the accident flight. Number 5, the pilot in command's decision to allow the second in command to act as pilot flying was improper and contrary to company standard operating procedures. Number 6, the pilot in command's extensive coaching of the second in command and his pilot flying duties distracted the pilot in command, interfered with the normal division of pilot flying and pilot monitoring duties, and degraded the flight crew's overall performance. Number 7, the pilot in command's decision to continue the approach was inappropriate because the approach did not meet the company's stabilized approach criteria and the airplane was not in a position to make a safe landing. Number 8, the pilot in command's focus on the visual maneuver of aligning the airplane with the landing runway distracted him from multiple indications of decreasing stall margin, resulting in an aerodynamic stall at low altitude. Number 9, a flight data monitoring program can help Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part 135 operators identify and mitigate procedural noncompliance, including the operational deficiencies identified in this accident investigation. Number 10, because the Federal Aviation Administration was not conducting checks in a manner that allowed observation of routine flight operations, the FAA could not evaluate Trans-Pacific Jet's pilots' compliance with standard operating procedures during these operations. Number 11, a safety management system would have improved Trans-Pacific Jet's ability to identify and mitigate risks because a safety management system requires operators to incorporate formal system safety methods into their internal oversight programs. Number 12, effective oversight procedures within the safety assurance system would help the Federal Aviation Administration identify operators that do not ensure flight crew compliance with standard operating procedures. Number 13, the pilot's performance on the accident flight included deficiencies that were noted during their initial Trans-Pacific Jet training, but the company did not monitor the pilot's subsequent performance to identify and correct any continued deficiencies. Number 14, although Trans-Pacific Jet's Crew Resource Management, or CRM, training program complied with the requirements of Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations 135.330, the Federal Aviation Administration had not provided adequate guidance for 14 CFR Part 135 operators to develop and implement effective CRM training programs. Consequently, Trans-Pacific's training did not result in the flight crew effectively using CRM to mitigate safety risks. Number 15, specific leadership training provided to Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part 135 and 91K pilots at the time of upgrade to pilot in command would help standardize and reinforce critical command authority skills and improve flight safety. Number 16, because the company did not have a Learjet qualified management pilot or check airman on staff during the accident second in command's or SIC's period of employment, Trans-Pacific Jet's graduated SIC qualification policy could not provide him and other company Learjet SICs a viable, well-structured path to gain experience as pilot flying. And lastly, number 17, including the manufacturer recommended approach speed wind additives in operations manuals for Learjet 35A airplanes could reduce the risk of a stall by requiring pilots to increase the approach speed in weather conditions conducive to rapid and possibly unexpected wind changes.
Thank you, Mr. Sledzik. Are there any amendments? Seeing none, do I have a motion to approve the findings as presented?
Second.
It's been moved by Member Weiner, seconded by Vice Chairman Landsberg. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of adopting the findings as presented, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed? There are none. The motion carries unanimously. Mr. Sledzik, if you'll please read the probable cause.
Yes, sir. Staff proposes the following probable cause. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of this accident was the pilot in command's, or PIC's, attempt to salvage an unstabilized visual approach, which resulted in an aerodynamic stall at low altitude. Contributing to the accident was the PIC's decision to allow an unapproved second in command to act as pilot flying, the PIC's inadequate and incomplete pre-flight planning, and the flight crew's lack of an approach briefing. Also contributing to the accident were Trans-Pacific Jet's lack of safety programs that would have enabled the company to identify and correct patterns of poor performance and procedural noncompliance, and the Federal Aviation Administration's ineffective safety assurance system procedures, which failed to identify these company oversight deficiencies.
Thank you. Are there any proposed amendments? There are none. Do I have a motion to adopt the probable cause as proposed?
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved by the Vice Chairman and seconded by Member Hamady. Is there any discussion? All in favor, seeing none, all in favor of adopting the probable cause as proposed, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed, there are none, so the probable cause is adopted unanimously. As far as the recommendations are concerned, Mr. Sledzik, if you'll please read those.
Yes, sir. We have 3 new recommendations and 6 reiterated recommendations. The new recommendations all go to the Federal Aviation Administration. Number 1, require all Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part 135 operators to establish programs for flight crew members who have demonstrated performance deficiencies or experienced failures during training and administer additional oversight and training to address and correct performance deficiencies. Second recommendation, develop guidance for Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part 135 operators to help them create and implement effective crew resource management training programs. And the last recommendation to the FAA, review operators' Learjet 35A operations manuals to determine whether they contain manufacturer recommended approach speed wind additives and encourage those operators without that information to add it to their operations documents. And I'll now read the reiterated recommendations, 6 of them, which are, again, all to the Federal Aviation Administration. Recommendation A-10-13, issue an advisory circular with guidance on leadership training for upgrading captains at 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part 121, 135, and 91K operators, including methods and techniques for effective leadership, professional standards of conduct, strategies for briefing and debriefing, reinforcement and correction skills, and other knowledge, skills, and abilities that are critical for air carrier operations. Second reiterated recommendation is A-10-14, require all 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part 121, 135, and 91K operators to provide a specific course on leadership training to their upgrading captains that is consistent with the advisory circular requested in Safety Recommendation A-10-13. Safety Recommendation A-16-34, require all 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part 135 operators to install flight data recording devices capable of supporting a flight data monitoring program. Safety Recommendation A-16-35, after the action and Safety Recommendation A-16-34 is completed, require all 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part 135 operators to establish a structured flight data monitoring program that reviews all available data sources to identify deviations from established norms and procedures and other potential safety issues. Safety Recommendation A-16-36, require all 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part 135 operators to establish safety management system programs. And lastly, Safety Recommendation A-16-41, review the safety assurance system and develop and implement procedures needed to identify 14 Code of Federal Regulations Part 135 operators that do not comply with standard operating procedures.
Thank you, and as I understand it too, Mr. Sledzik, we are reclassifying recommendation A-16-41 as open unacceptable response.
That is correct, sir, yes.
Thank you very much. Are there any proposed amendments? Do I have a motion to adopt the, well, let me ask a question if I may. Thank you. On recommendation 3, we say require operators of Lear 35, require the operators Lear 35A operations manuals to determine whether they have the appropriate speed additives in there. Why did we single out the 35A? There are a lot of there's other Learjets out there, there's other airplanes. Why did we single out that airplane?
Not singling it out, but we did, in this accident, only look at the Lear 35A. So we discovered it wasn't in the operations manual, so that is why we only address the 35A.
Yes, and I also raised that question when I wrote my memo, and staff did specifically comment because I did raise that, and that we have seen a number of accidents actually in involving an uncommanded roll of the 35A, one in Marianna, Florida, Nashville, Tennessee, Goodland, Kansas, Prospect Heights, Illinois. So we've actually seen accidents involving this particular model due to a roll-off due to improper speed. Thank you. Okay, do we have a motion to adopt the recommendations as presented? Member Weiner has adopted, or excuse me, has motioned to adopt the recommendations, and Member Homendy has seconded it. Any further discussion? Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of adopting the recommendations as proposed, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed, there are none. The recommendations are adopted unanimously. Does anyone have any additional issues for discussion at this point? Does anyone have a motion to adopt the report as presented?
So moved.
The Vice Chairman has so moved. Member Weiner has seconded it. Any discussion? All in favor of adopting the report as presented, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed, there are none. The report has been adopted unanimously. Do any members wish to reserve the right to file a concurring or dissenting statement? Okay. So in closing, I want to thank the staff for your hard work. I think this was a very good investigation. I think that there are some very good recommendations that have come out of this report. I want to thank my colleagues for preparation for this meeting. Going into meeting as we meet one-on-one, we meet with staff ahead of time to discuss the report. We write memos accordingly. So I want to thank you for your preparation going into the board meeting and for the good debate and discussion today. My special thanks to you, Jim Silliman, who served as the investigator in charge. But as I often say here, nothing gets done by just one person alone. It takes a team. And a sincere thank you, not only to the investigative team, but to everyone else, the support staff and the program staff as well, who support our efforts. Finally, I want to thank the first responders and the other public servants from Bergen County, New Jersey, from the boroughs of Carlstadt and East Rutherford, New Jersey. Thank you all for your help, and thank you for being here today so that we could thank you, all of your good support. Also want to thank the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey for their truly exemplary support and cooperation on scene. Each time you take a Part 121 flight, you benefit from safety programs that can and should be extended to Part 135 operations. The recommendations just issued, if acted upon, will help to close that gap. The recommendations reiterated today are just as important. The NTSB continues to support a single high level of safety in aviation. We stand adjourned.